Let's talk about buying a home. So a common question we receive is, hey, look, Seth, I'm clear on the home buying process. I've done my research. I know how to begin that process, but how do I know if I'm actually ready? It's a common occurrence that you get started in your career, you start making some money, and you take a look at that rent you're paying every month and go, man, I sure wish I had something to show for all this money I'm shelling out every month. And so the tendency is to want to go, well, hey, for that much rent, I can go buy this much house. But hold on a second. Before you go and begin the home buying process, let's kind of run through the checklist and make sure you've covered your financial fundamentals before you jump off and go buy a house. So we're going to cover kind of the basics that you ought to have accounted for prior to beginning the home buying process. And you're going to realize this is some of the fundamentals that you should just generally have squared away, kind of first things first wise in your financial life. So number one, before you go off and begin the process to buy a home, you got to understand your budget. You got to understand your budget, and you got to know where your money's going on a month in and month out basis. We have another video covering kind of the basics of budgeting. I would encourage you to check that out. And the other thing you need to have set up is you need to have your emergency fund in place. Now, the two of these kind of go hand in hand. As you've seen in our video covering, the emergency fund should be about 3 to 6 months worth of your monthly expenses. And of course, you can't calculate that 3 to 6 times if you don't know what your monthly expenses are. So you got to know your budget, know how much you're spending. You got to have saved up a healthy emergency fund. Next up, if you're talking about buying a home, you're talking about taking on a significant amount of debt. So before you go and do that, you want to make sure you have your other debts under control. So what does that mean? Other debts under control. So you want to have all of your high interest rate debt. So think like credit card type rate debt. You want to have that paid off before you even thinking about taking on the obligation of buying a home. You want to pay off the high interest rate debt. And with that, you want to make sure you have a good credit score. You want to have a good credit history of making your payments on time. You may want to go pull your credit score and see where you stand, because that is going to impact the rate of interest that you're able to be approved for to purchase your home. So you've got budget in place, emergency fund in place. You've got other debts under control. And now think about beyond the emergency fund, you also need to have saved up a down payment for your home. You don't want to dip into your emergency fund to fund your down payment for the home, right? So as you see, this whole home buying process, it's not as straightforward as let me just switch from paying rent to paying a mortgage. You need to have the groundwork in place. So let's say you're going, okay, down the list of what I just mentioned, you go check, 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 check. Okay, Seth, I'm good to go. So let's briefly touch on this topic of how much house could you afford. Now, we do have a whole separate video on how much house you can afford, but I want to briefly touch on it here because it'll help you make an assessment as to whether or not you're even ready. So I want to refer to a couple of ratios that are commonly used to determine appropriate debt amounts and levels. So they're called the housing ratios 1 and 2. Housing ratio 1, housing ratio 2. Sometimes they're referred to as debt ratio 1 and debt ratio 2. So debt ratio 1 would just be your monthly payment toward housing. So if you're renting right now, it's just your rent payment. Your housing payment, if you're in a home, would be your mortgage payment plus all those extras. Again, you can check our video on how much house you could afford for more details. So that first debt ratio is, think 28%, which is your total housing payment should not exceed 28% of your gross monthly income. If your salary, take your annual salary, divide by 12, that's your gross monthly. 28% of that would be ideally your maximum housing payment. Now, the other component of that is to think about this. Okay, great. I'm under that 28% mark, but I also have a ton of other debts that I have to pay on a monthly basis. That's where that second debt ratio, or the housing ratio 2, comes into play. And it looks at all debt payments over the course of a month. So if you add your housing payment and all other debt payments, that total should not exceed 36% of your gross monthly income. So the question is, am I ready to buy a home? Mark off all the things in the list prior that I list, right? Budget in place, emergency fund in place, other debts under control, you saved up for a down payment, and then whatever house you're going to buy is not going to exceed 28% of your gross monthly income, and then all debt payments do not exceed 36% of your gross monthly income. Okay, so let's say you're ready. let's say you marked off all the things on your list, you're saved up, ready to go, clear on how much you can afford. Now, we answered one question, which is, are you ready to buy a home? Now, there's another question entirely, which is, should you buy a home? Because there are pros and cons. And for that, I would encourage you to check out our other video specifically addressing that, which is, should you buy a home at this point?